The winter of 1876 brought more than just biting cold to Silver Creek, Wyoming. It carried with it a desperate woman fleeing through the night, her breath visible in the frigid air as she stumbled across the harsh terrain. Victoria Turner had run until her lungs burned, and her legs threatened to give out beneath her. But the sound of hoofbeats in the distance drove her forward through the darkness, away from the nightmare that had become her life. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the vast, untamed landscape as Victoria frantically searched for somewhere, anywhere to hide. Her face throbbed from the blows she had received, her right eye swelling shut, and her split lip tasting of copper. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, partly from fear and partly from the freezing temperature that cut through her thin dress. She had escaped with only what she wore, and a small bundle clutched against her chest, a pitiful collection of belongings that represented all she had left in the world. The sound of pursuit grew louder, and Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. They were getting closer. He was getting closer. Just when her strength was about to fail, she spotted the dim glow of a lantern in the distance. A small cabin nestled against the foothills, smoke curling from its chimney. Hope flared in her chest, giving her one last surge of energy as she stumbled toward the light. Behind the cabin stood a modest barn, its door slightly ajar. Victoria slipped inside, the relative warmth a blessed relief from the biting cold. The scent of hay and horses filled her nostrils as she collapsed against a stall, struggling to quiet her ragged breathing. A large chestnut mare nickered softly, regarding the intruder with gentle curiosity. "It's all right, girl," Victoria whispered, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. "I won't stay long, just until they pass." She hadn't expected the horse to respond, but the deep voice that came from the shadows nearly stopped her heart. "Who's passing by, madam?" Victoria scrambled backward, her bruised body protesting every movement as she pressed herself against the rough wooden wall. A tall figure stepped into the dim light cast by a hanging lantern, and she could make out the silhouette of a man in a wide-brimmed hat, a revolver held casually at his side. "Please," she begged, raising her hands defensively. "I meant no harm. I just needed shelter for a moment." The man stepped closer, and the lantern light revealed his face weathered by sun and wind, stubbled with several days' growth of beard, but his eyes were surprisingly gentle as they took in her appearance. She watched as his expression shifted from wariness to concern. "My God, what happened to you?" he asked, holstering his gun and approaching slowly as one might a frightened animal. Victoria couldn't answer. The words caught in her throat as tears welled in her eyes. The adrenaline that had kept her moving began to fade, leaving only pain and exhaustion in its wake. Her hands shook violently as she tried to wipe the tears from her battered face. The cowboy knelt before her, keeping a respectful distance. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low and steady. "No one's going to hurt you here." For the first time in what felt like forever, Victoria allowed herself to believe those words might be true. Her strength finally gave out, and darkness claimed her as she slumped forward. The last thing she felt was strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. When Victoria regained consciousness, she was no longer in the barn but in a small cabin. Warmth surrounded her from a crackling fire in a stone hearth. She was lying on a narrow bed, covered with a patchwork quilt that smelled of pine and tobacco. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind until the memories came flooding back, along with the pain. She tried to sit up, only to gasp as her ribs protested the movement. "Easy there," came the same deep voice from before. The cowboy was seated in a rough-hewn chair a few feet away. "You've got some nasty bruises. Best not move too quick." Victoria tensed, her eyes darting toward the door, assessing her chances of escape. "The name's Bryce Lawson," he said, making no move to come closer. "You're at my homestead about 15 miles outside of Silver Creek. You passed out in my barn." "How long have I been unconscious?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a couple of hours. Sun will be up soon." Bryce stood and moved to the stove, where a pot was simmering. "Figured you might be hungry when you woke." Victoria watched him warily as he poured something into a tin cup. The smell of coffee reached her, rich and inviting. When he approached, he did so slowly, extending the cup without coming too close. "Thank you," she said, taking the coffee with still trembling hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers, providing a small comfort. "I don't mean to pry, madam, but I reckon someone's looking for you," Bryce said, returning to his chair. "And judging by the state of your face, I'm guessing they're not friendly folks." Victoria stared into her cup, the dark liquid reflecting the firelight. "My name is Victoria Turner," she finally said. "And yes, someone is looking for me. My husband, Jeffrey." "Husband?" Bryce's jaw tightened. "A man who'd do that to his wife ain't worthy of the title." "We've been married 3 years," Victoria continued, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. "It wasn't always like this. Jeffrey was charming once, attentive. But after we married and moved west from Boston, things changed. He became different, controlling, angry." Bryce said nothing, just listened as Victoria clutched the coffee cup like a lifeline. "Last night was the worst it's ever been," she admitted. "I thought he might kill me. When he finally passed out drunk, I took what I could carry and ran." "You did right," Bryce said firmly. "No one deserves to live in fear like that." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional whinny from the horses in the nearby barn. Victoria felt the weight of her situation pressing down on her. She had no money, no family in the territory, and a husband who would surely be searching for her come daylight. "I should leave at first light," she said, though the thought of venturing back into the cold with nowhere to go filled her with dread. "I've troubled you enough." Bryce shook his head. "It's no trouble, and you're in no condition to travel. Besides, a storm's brewing. Can feel it in my bones." He stood and moved to add another log to the fire. "You're welcome to stay until you're healed up and have a plan. This cabin ain't much, but it's quiet, and no one comes out this way without business." Victoria's eyes filled with tears again, this time from gratitude rather than pain or fear. "Why would you help a stranger like this?" Bryce was quiet for a moment, his face half-shadowed as he stoked the fire. "My sister was married to a man like your Jeffrey," he said finally. "I was working cattle drives down in Texas when it happened. By the time I got word and made it back, she was gone. Buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch she loved." His voice remained steady, but Victoria could hear the pain beneath the words. "I promised myself I'd never stand by again if I could help." Their eyes met across the small cabin, and Victoria saw not pity but understanding in his gaze. For the first time since fleeing her husband's rage, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "Get some rest, Miss Turner," Bryce said, moving toward the door. "I'll keep watch, make sure no one approaches without us knowing. You're safe here." As Bryce stepped outside into the pre-dawn chill, Victoria sank back against the pillow. Safe. The word echoed in her mind as exhaustion overtook her once more. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring or how she would rebuild her shattered life. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to believe in that promise of safety. The next few days passed in a haze of recovery and caution. True to Bryce's prediction, a winter storm descended upon the region, blanketing the landscape in white and making travel all but impossible. Victoria was grateful for the forced isolation. It meant Jeffrey couldn't be searching the countryside for her, at least not effectively. Bryce proved to be a quiet but considerate host. He slept in the barn despite Victoria's protests, insisting she needed the comfort of the cabin more than he did. Each morning, he would bring fresh coffee and whatever simple meal he had prepared, usually beans and bacon, occasionally supplemented with dried fruits or preserved vegetables from his modest stores. The bruises on Victoria's face began to fade from angry purple to sickly yellow, and though her ribs still ached when she moved too quickly, she found herself growing stronger with each passing day. She insisted on helping with whatever task she could manage, unwilling to be merely a burden. Bryce taught her to tend the small stove, showed her how he kept track of supplies, and even demonstrated how to clean and oil his rifle, a skill, he noted soberly, that might serve her well someday. On the fourth evening, as they sat at the rough-hewn table sharing a dinner of rabbit stew, Victoria finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "What will you do when the snow clears and he comes looking for me?" Her voice was steadier now, the constant fear having receded somewhat during her days at the cabin. Bryce considered her question as he broke a piece of cornbread. "Legally, he's still your husband," he said carefully, "but that doesn't give him the right to harm you." "The law doesn't always protect women like me," Victoria replied, having learned this bitter truth firsthand. "Jeffrey has friends in town, business associates. His word would be taken over mine." "Then perhaps Silver Creek isn't where you should be," Bryce suggested. "Wyoming's a big territory. Bigger still if you consider Montana or Colorado." Victoria stared into her bowl, watching the steam rise. "I have no money, no connections. Where would I go? How would I live?" "There are options," Bryce said. "When the weather breaks, I need to make a trip into town for supplies. Got some furs to trade, too. While I'm there, I can ask around discreet-like. There's always work for those willing to do it." Victoria nodded, though the prospect of starting anew with nothing was daunting. "I worked as a teacher back in Boston before I married. I can read and write, do figures. I'm not afraid of hard work." "That's valuable out here," Bryce said with an approving nod. "Lot of settlements springing up that need educated folks." As they continued eating, Victoria found herself studying her host more closely. Bryce Lawson wasn't what she'd expected from a frontier trapper and homesteader. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged appearance, an intelligence in his eyes that spoke of more than just survival knowledge. She wondered about his life before this isolated cabin, what circumstances had brought him to this solitary existence. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured. Bryce looked up from his stew, one eyebrow raised slightly. "Reckon you can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." "Why do you live out here alone? You seem like a man who could make his way anywhere." A small smile touched his lips. "Tried that. Towns, cities, even a cattle outfit down in Texas for a spell. Never quite fit." He gestured to the cabin around them. "Out here, things are simpler. Just me, the mountains, and whatever the good Lord sees fit to provide." He paused, then added, "After my sister died, I needed the quiet. Time to think, to remember who I was." Victoria nodded, understanding the need for solitude all too well. "And have you remembered who you are?" Bryce's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain, perhaps, or mutual understanding. "Getting there," he said softly. "Day by day." The conversation drifted to lighter topics after that, stories of Bryce's hunting expeditions, Victoria's recollections of teaching children in Boston, the differences between Eastern and Western life. For a brief while, they were just two people sharing a meal and conversation, the circumstances that had brought them together temporarily set aside. Later that night, As Victoria lay in the narrow bed listening to the wind howling outside, she found herself thinking about how quickly life could change. A week ago, she had been trapped in a marriage that had become a prison, believing there was no escape. Now, despite the uncertainty of her future, she had found a temporary haven and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginnings of a path forward. The storm finally broke after a week, leaving the world transformed under a pristine blanket of snow. Bryce announced his intention to ride into Silver Creek the following day, a journey that would take him the better part of the day considering the conditions. "I'll be back before nightfall," he promised as he prepared for the trip, packing furs and other trade goods onto his sturdy packhorse. "Bar the door while I'm gone and keep the rifle close. Not likely anyone will come calling, but better to be prepared." Victoria nodded, accepting the Winchester he offered her. "I'll be fine. Please be careful." "Always am," he replied with a slight smile that softened his weathered features. As she watched him ride away, the small figure gradually disappearing into the vast whiteness, Victoria felt a flutter of anxiety. It wasn't just concern for his safety on the difficult journey or even fear of being alone, though those were certainly present. It was something more, a realization that in the short time she'd known Bryce Lawson, he had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Shaking off the feeling, Victoria turned her attention to the tasks at hand. She had insisted on taking care of the livestock while Bryce was gone, wanting to be useful rather than idle. The physical work helped keep her mind focused, away from both the past she was fleeing and the uncertain future ahead. By midday, Victoria had fed the horses, collected eggs from the small chicken coop, and even managed to chop a modest pile of kindling for the stove. Her ribs protested at the exertion, but the pain was less now, more a reminder than a hindrance. As she worked, she found herself humming softly a folk tune her father had often sung when she was a child. It struck her suddenly that this was the first time she had felt like singing in years. The afternoon brought with it darker skies and a sharp drop in temperature. Victoria retreated to the cabin, barring the door as Bryce had instructed and keeping the rifle within reach. She busied herself with mending some of Bryce's shirts that she had noticed needed attention, grateful for the simple domestic task that reminded her of peaceful times before her marriage. As dusk approached with no sign of Bryce's return, Victoria began to worry. She knew the journey was challenging, especially with the fresh snow, but she had expected him by now. Every few minutes, she would move to the small window, straining to see through the gathering darkness for any sign of movement. When she finally heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching, relief washed over her, followed immediately by trepidation. What if it wasn't Bryce? What if Jeffrey had somehow tracked her to this remote cabin? Victoria gripped the rifle, positioning herself beside the window where she could see without being easily seen. The figure that emerged from the twilight was indeed Bryce, but even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong. He was slumped forward in the saddle, his movements lacking their usual fluid grace. She hastily unbarred the door and rushed out, heedless of the cold. Bryce managed to dismount but staggered as his feet hit the ground. Victoria reached him just as he seemed about to fall, slipping her shoulder under his arm to support him. "What happened?" she asked, helping him toward the cabin. "Ran into some trouble in town," Bryce said through gritted teeth. "Your husband's men, they've been searching for you." Victoria's heart pounded as they made it inside. In the light of the cabin, she could see blood staining Bryce's coat, a long slash across his left arm and another at his temple. "Sit down," she commanded, helping him to a chair before hurrying to gather clean cloths and water. "Tell me what happened. All of it." As she cleaned his wounds, Bryce recounted his day in Silver Creek. He had been careful, asking subtle questions about work opportunities in neighboring settlements rather than directly inquiring about Victoria. But Jeffrey Turner was a man of means and influence. He had posted rewards for information about his missing wife and had hired men to search for her. "They're saying you stole from him before running off," Bryce explained as Victoria stitched the deeper cut on his arm with steady hands. "It's a lie, of course, but it gives him cover for wanting you found so badly." "Did they follow you?" Victoria asked, her voice tight with fear. Bryce shook his head. "No, got into a scuffle with two of them behind the trading post when they got suspicious of my questions. Managed to lose them in the confusion afterward, took the long way back to be sure." He winced as Victoria tied off the last stitch. "They don't know where I live or who I am. We're safe for now." Victoria sat back, her hands stained with his blood. "You're hurt because of me," she said softly. "I've brought danger to your door." Bryce reached out, covering her hand with his. "I knew what I was doing when I took you in, Victoria. I don't regret it." Their eyes met, and Victoria felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Before she could respond, Bryce continued, "I did learn something useful in town. There's a settlement 3 days' ride north, just over the Montana line. They're in need of a teacher for the coming spring. The storekeeper there is an old friend, said he'd put in a good word if I knew someone suitable." Hope flared in Victoria's chest. "A teaching position, truly," Bryce nodded. "It's a small place out of the way. Your husband's influence wouldn't reach there, especially if you used a different name." "When could I go?" Victoria asked, already imagining a new life, a fresh start. "Not for a few weeks at least," Bryce cautioned. "The mountain passes are still treacherous, and we need to be certain no one's watching the trails." He hesitated, then added, "And there's the matter of your husband's men in Silver Creek. They'll be looking more carefully now." Victoria's hope dimmed somewhat at the reminder of the obstacles still facing her. "So I'm still trapped, just in a larger cage." "For now," Bryce agreed. "But not forever. We'll find a way to get you to that teaching position when the time is right." As she finished bandaging his wounds, Victoria was struck by Bryce's use of "we." He had taken her plight as his own, risked himself for her safety and future. In the short time she had known him, he had shown her more kindness and respect than Jeffrey had in years of marriage. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to adequately express her gratitude with words. Bryce's hand remained on hers, warm and calloused. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right." That night, as Victoria lay awake listening to the wind outside, her thoughts were filled not with fear of Jeffrey finding her, but with the growing awareness of her feelings for Bryce Lawson, feelings that both comforted and frightened her. She was still a married woman, still bound by laws and vows, even if those vows had been violated by the man who had sworn to honor them. And soon, if all went as planned, she would be leaving for a new life far away from this cabin and the man who had become her protector. Yet in the quiet darkness, Victoria allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to stay not out of necessity or fear, but by choice. To build a life in this wild, beautiful place with a man whose quiet strength had become her anchor in a storm. It was a dangerous thought, one she could not afford to entertain. But as sleep finally claimed her, it was Bryce's face she saw, his gentle eyes and rare smile following her into dreams that, for once, were not haunted by the past. The following weeks brought a delicate routine to the small cabin. Bryce focused on hunting and trapping, building up supplies they would need for Victoria's eventual journey north. Victoria took over more of the domestic duties, finding a sense of purpose in creating a home-like atmosphere in the rustic dwelling. They worked alongside each other during the days, sharing meals and conversation in the evenings by the warmth of the fire. Neither spoke directly about the growing connection between them, though it manifested in 100 small ways: the lingering touch when passing a cup of coffee, the way their eyes sought each other across the room, the comfortable silences that fell between them, no longer awkward but filled with unspoken understanding. February gave way to March, and with it came the first hints of spring. The snow began to recede from the southern slopes, and the days grew incrementally longer. Bryce made 2 more cautious trips to Silver Creek, returning with news that the search for Victoria seemed to have cooled, at least in the immediate area. "Your husband's still offering a reward," he reported after his last visit, "but his men aren't as visible in town. Word is he's extended the search to Cheyenne and even Denver." Victoria felt relief at this news, though she knew better than to believe Jeffrey had given up. "He won't stop looking," she said quietly as they sat at the table, a map spread between them. "He sees me as his possession. He can't accept that I've escaped him." Bryce nodded, his finger tracing the route they had planned for her journey. "All the more reason to get you to Clearwater. It's small enough that newcomers are noticed, but the people there look after their own. Once you're established as the schoolteacher, you'll have the town's protection." Victoria studied the map, memorizing the landmarks Bryce had pointed out. The journey would take at least 4 days, possibly longer depending on conditions. Bryce had arranged for supplies to be waiting with his friend at the trading post in Clearwater enough to see her through until her first month's wages as a teacher. "When do you think I should leave?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt at the prospect of facing the wilderness alone. "Another week, maybe 2, Bryce answered, folding the map. "The last snow should be melted from the high pass by then, and you'll have the full moon for traveling at night if needed." Victoria nodded, accepting his judgment. In the weeks she had spent at the cabin, she had come to trust Bryce's knowledge of the land and its rhythms implicitly. If he said 2 weeks was the right time, then 2 weeks it would be. That night, a spring storm rolled through, bringing not snow but heavy rain that drummed against the cabin roof. The sound was soothing, creating a cocoon of comfort within the small space. Victoria sat mending a tear in the pack she would carry on her journey, while Bryce cleaned his firearms at the table, a task he performed with methodical care. "I've been thinking," Bryce said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Maybe I should accompany you to Clearwater." Victoria looked up from her sewing. "You said yourself that it would be safer if I traveled alone, less likely to draw attention." "I know what I said," Bryce acknowledged, his hand still moving over the disassembled rifle. "But the closer it gets to time for you to leave, the less I like the idea of you making that journey by yourself." Victoria set down her mending, studying his profile in the lamplight. "Is it because you don't think I'm capable?" Bryce finally looked up, meeting her gaze. "No. You're more capable than most men I've known." A smile flickered across his face. "You can shoot straight, build a fire in the rain, and find north on a cloudy night. I've made sure of that." "Then why?" Victoria pressed, though part of her already knew the answer, the same answer that made her heart race whenever their hands brushed accidentally, or when she caught him watching her with an expression that mirrored her own confused feelings. Bryce set down the rifle part he had been oiling, his movements deliberate. "Because I care what happens to you," he said simply. "More than I should, given the circumstances." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Victoria felt her breath catch, the directness of his words both frightening and exhilarating. "I care about you too," she replied softly. "And that's why I need to go alone. If Jeffrey's men saw us together, they would assume the worst. They would hunt you down without mercy, and I couldn't bear that." Bryce's jaw tightened, but he nodded in reluctant agreement. "You're right. I don't like it, but you're right." Victoria rose from her chair and moved to sit beside him at the table. "These weeks here, they've meant everything to me," she said. "You've shown me that not all men are like Jeffrey, that kindness doesn't always come with conditions attached." "It shouldn't," Bryce said, his voice low. "What's between us, it's not something I planned or expected, but it's real, Victoria. At least for me." "For me too," she admitted, allowing herself to be honest in this moment, whatever the future might hold. "When I fled that night, I was running from something. I never imagined I might be running towards something instead." Bryce's hand found hers on the table, his palm rough against her softer skin. "When you get to Clearwater, get settled in that teaching position," he said. "I'd like to come visit, properly, if you'd be amenable to that." Victoria felt a smile spread across her face, genuine and hopeful. "I'd like that very much." The rain continued to fall outside, wrapping the cabin in its steady rhythm as they sat together, hands entwined, speaking of possibilities rather than fears for the first time since Victoria had stumbled into Bryce's barn that fateful night. They spent the next week preparing for Victoria's departure, with an intensity that left little time for dwelling on the coming separation. Bryce taught her everything he could about survival on the trail, how to find water, how to move without leaving obvious tracks, how to treat minor injuries with the limited supplies she would carry. Victoria absorbed it all eagerly, determined to make this journey successfully. 4 days before her planned departure, Bryce returned from checking his trap lines with news that changed everything. "Riders," he said as he burst through the cabin door, his expression grim. "3 of them following the creek bed toward the North Ridge. They're not locals." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "Jeffrey's men, can't be sure, but they're armed and moving like they're searching for something." Bryce moved quickly around the cabin, gathering essential items. "We need to leave, now. Leave." "But I thought plans change," Bryce interrupted, handing her the pack they had prepared. "If they find this place and recognize you, we lose any advantage we had. Better to be gone before they arrive." Victoria didn't argue, trusting Bryce's instincts. Within 15 minutes, they had the horses saddled and loaded with the supplies they would need. Bryce took one last look at the cabin that had been his home for years, his expression unreadable. "We'll head west, then circle north," he said as they mounted. "It's rougher terrain, but less likely they'd follow that way." They rode hard for several hours, pushing the horses as much as they dared through the difficult landscape. Victoria's body ached from the pace and tension, but fear kept her alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. By nightfall, they had reached a sheltered ravine where Bryce deemed it safe enough to make camp. "No fire tonight," he said as they unsaddled the horses. "Can't risk the light being seen." They ate a cold supper of jerky and hardtack, huddled close for warmth as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. The stars emerged overhead, countless pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. "You think they found the cabin?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper though they were miles from any potential pursuers. "Probably," Bryce admitted. "But they won't know for certain you were there unless they're the same men who saw me in town. Even then, they can only guess which way we went." Victoria pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I'm sorry about your home." Bryce was quiet for a moment. "It was just a place," he said finally. "4 walls and a roof. Been thinking lately it might be time for a change anyway." Their eyes met in the darkness, and Victoria felt the weight of what remained unspoken between them. This unplanned flight had forced their hands, thrown them together on a journey neither had anticipated taking this way. The boundaries that had existed in the cabin, her status as a married woman, his role as protector, the careful distance they had maintained despite growing feelings seemed less defined now, blurred by circumstance and necessity. "Get some rest," Bryce said gently. "I'll take first watch. We have a long ride ahead tomorrow." Victoria nodded, settling onto her bedroll. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead and of the man sitting vigilant nearby, whose presence had come to mean safety and hope in a world that had offered her little of either. She must have dozed eventually, for she woke to Bryce's hand on her shoulder, the sky above them lightening with the first hint of dawn. "Time to move," he said softly. "I heard riders to the south around midnight. They're not on our trail yet, but we shouldn't linger." They ate quickly and resumed their journey, following game trails and dry creek beds to mask their passage. By midday, they had reached the foothills of a mountain range Bryce identified as the Bighorns. "We'll head through Granite Pass," he explained as they paused to rest the horses. "It's narrow but passable this time of year. Once we're through, we'll be less than 2 days' ride from Clearwater." Victoria nodded, trying to ignore the twist of emotion in her chest at the thought of reaching their destination so soon. Their unexpected departure had accelerated her plans, bringing the moment of separation closer than she had been prepared for. "And then?" she asked, unable to keep the question inside. Bryce looked at her, his eyes reflecting the same conflict she felt. "Then you become the new school teacher just like we planned." "And you," Victoria pressed. "I'll make sure you're settled safely," Bryce said, his gaze steady. "After that, well, that depends on a few things." Before Victoria could ask what those things might be, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoed through the hills, followed by the sound of a bullet striking rock not far from where they stood. "Get down," Bryce shouted, pulling Victoria behind a large boulder as a second shot rang out. Heart pounding, Victoria pressed herself against the rock, the rough surface scraping her palms. "They found us," she whispered, fear making her voice shake. "3 riders coming up from the south," Bryce confirmed, peering carefully around the edge of their shelter. "They must have picked up our trail." He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, checking that it was loaded. "When I fire, you run for the horses. Get to that stand of pines and wait for me." "I'm not leaving you," Victoria protested, reaching for the revolver Bryce had insisted she carry. "This isn't a debate," Bryce said firmly. "Those men want you, not me. If we both get pinned down here, we both lose." Before Victoria could argue further, Bryce rose slightly and fired 2 quick shots toward their pursuers. The sound of returned fire came almost immediately, bullets splintering the rock above their heads. "Now, Victoria," Bryce urged. "Go." Swallowing her fear, Victoria darted from behind the boulder, running in a crooked pattern as Bryce had taught her, making herself a difficult target. She heard more gunfire behind her but didn't look back, focused only on reaching the horses that were tethered at the edge of a small grove of pines. She had just untied the reins when she heard a shout of pain that could only have come from Bryce. Turning, Victoria saw him stumbling from behind the boulder, one arm pressed against his side as he fired backward with his other hand. Without hesitation, Victoria mounted her horse and kicked it forward, racing toward Bryce even as bullets whistled past. She reached him as he fired his last shot, his face pale beneath his tan. "Get on," she commanded, extending her hand. For once, Bryce didn't argue. He grasped her arm, swinging up behind her with a grunt of pain. Victoria could feel something warm and wet seeping through her jacket where his body pressed against hers blood. "The pines," Bryce directed, his voice tight. "Quick as you can." Victoria urged the horse forward, riding hard for the cover of the trees. Behind them, she could hear their pursuers shouting, the sounds of horses being mounted in pursuit. Once within the shelter of the pines, she found Bryce's horse waiting, still tethered where they had left it. "Can you ride?" she asked, feeling him slump slightly against her back. "Have to," Bryce answered, sliding off her horse with effort. "It's just a graze. Looks worse than it is." Victoria could see now the bloody stain spreading across his shirt just above his right hip. "We need to stop the bleeding." "No time," Bryce said, mounting his own horse with visible effort. "They'll be on us in minutes. We need to reach the pass." He was right, Victoria knew. As much as she wanted to tend to his wound, their survival depended on putting distance between themselves and Jeffrey's men. With a nod, she turned her horse toward the narrow trail that would lead them up into the mountains. They rode hard for nearly an hour, pushing the horses to their limits on the increasingly difficult terrain. The trail narrowed as they ascended, forcing them to ride single file through passages where the rocks rose steep on either side. Bryce led the way, though Victoria could see the strain in his posture, the effort it took him to remain upright in the saddle. When they reached a small plateau near the highest point of the pass, Bryce finally signaled for them to stop. Both horses were lathered with sweat, their sides heaving from the exertion of the climb. "We need to rest them," Bryce said, dismounting carefully. His face was ashen now, his movements stiff as he tied his horse to a stunted pine. "Let me see that wound," Victoria insisted, sliding from her saddle and moving to his side. This time, Bryce didn't protest as she helped him remove his coat and lifted his blood-soaked shirt. The bullet had torn a furrow across his side, just above his hip bone. It wasn't deep enough to have caused internal damage, but the blood loss was concerning. Using water from their canteen and strips torn from her petticoat, Victoria cleaned the wound as best she could before binding it tightly. Bryce remained silent throughout, his jaw clenched against the pain. "We should be safe for a little while," he said when she had finished. "That last stretch of trail is too narrow for them to come up three abreast. They'll have to come one by one." "Which makes them easier targets," Victoria concluded, understanding his strategy. She helped him move to a position where he had a clear view of the trail below. His rifle rested on a flat rock for stability. "There's another path down from here," Bryce said, gesturing to a barely visible trail that led eastward from the plateau. "If they get too close, you take it. It'll lead you down to the valley on the other side. Keep the North Star on your right shoulder at night and you'll reach Clearwater in 2 days." Victoria stared at him, suddenly understanding. "You're not suggesting I leave you here?" "If it comes to that," Bryce said, his eyes steady on hers, "my job is to get you to safety." "No," Victoria said firmly. "We started this together, we'll finish it together. I'm not leaving you to face them alone." Before Bryce could argue, the sound of horses on the trail below caught their attention. Victoria moved to position herself behind another rock, her revolver ready. They watched in tense silence as a single rider appeared on the narrow path, followed at a distance by 2 more. "Jeffries sent his best," Bryce murmured. "That's Dan Hollister in front. Hired gun from Texas, known for bringing in bounties dead rather than alive." Victoria felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "He's hired a bounty hunter to find me. Your husband's desperate," Bryce said grimly. "Men like that do desperate things when their pride is wounded." They fell silent as Hollister and his companions drew nearer. When the lead rider was just within range, Bryce took careful aim and fired. The shot echoed through the mountains as Hollister's hat flew off his head, causing him to rein his horse in sharply. "That's close enough," Bryce called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Next one won't miss." Hollister raised his hand slowly, making no move for his weapon. "No need for bloodshed, friend," he called back. "We're just looking for a woman, runaway wife of a gentleman in Silver Creek, Seen anyone fitting that description? Haven't seen any runaways, Bryce replied. Just a lot of folks who ought to mind their own business. Hollister chuckled, though there was no humor in the sound. $500 is my business, friend. That's what the lady's husband is offering for her safe return. Victoria felt sick at the thought of Jeffrey putting a price on her like chattel. Beside her, Bryce's expression hardened. The lady's not property to be bought and sold, he said, his rifle still trained on Hollister. Best you turn around and tell Mr. Turner his wife's not coming back. At the mention of Jeffrey's name, Hollister's casual demeanor shifted. So you do know who we're after, he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. That makes things simpler. Hand her over and we'll let you ride away. Fight us, and you won't leave these mountains alive. Those are big words for a man with a rifle aimed at his chest, Bryce responded coolly. Now, I'm giving you one chance to turn around and ride back the way you came. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, Hollister reached for something in his saddlebag. Victoria tensed, expecting him to draw a weapon, but instead he pulled out what appeared to be a piece of paper. Got something you might want to see first, Hollister called, holding the paper up. Official warrant for the arrest of Victoria Turner, charged with theft and abandonment of her marital duties. He paused, a malicious smile spreading across his face. And for her accomplice, one Bryce Lawson, charged with abduction of a married woman. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Bryce remained outwardly calm, but she could see the tightening of his jaw. Those charges are false, she called out, unable to remain silent any longer. Mrs. Turner, Hollister acknowledged with a mocking tip of his head, your husband will be pleased to know you're alive. As for the charges, well, that's for a judge to decide, isn't it? Now, why don't you both come along peacefully? Save us all a lot of trouble. Not happening, Bryce said flatly. Victoria's not going back to a man who beat her half to death. Warrant or no warrant. Hollister's expression hardened. Have it your way. He whistled sharply, and suddenly his two companions were moving, splitting to either side of the trail, using the rocks for cover as they began to work their way upward. Get down, Bryce shouted as gunfire erupted from below. He returned fire, his shots carefully placed despite his injury. Victoria crouched behind her rock, heart pounding as bullets ricocheted off the stones around them. When one of Hollister's men exposed himself to take aim, she steadied her revolver with both hands and fired, just as Bryce had taught her. The man yelled in pain, dropping his rifle as he clutched his shoulder. Good shot, Bryce said, his voice tight with strain as he reloaded. The exchange of gunfire continued for what felt like hours but was likely only minutes. Victoria was down to her last few bullets when she noticed Hollister and his unwounded companion had disappeared from view. Where did they go? She asked, scanning the rocks below. Bryce shook his head, his face now shining with sweat despite the cool air. Don't know, could be circling around looking for another way up. The silence was suddenly more unnerving than the gunfire had been. Victoria moved closer to Bryce, noting with alarm how pale he had become. The bandage on his side was soaked through with fresh blood, evidence that the exertion of the gunfight had reopened his wound. You're bleeding again, she said, reaching for their dwindling medical supplies. Bryce waved her away. No time. We need to move before they find another route up here. As if in answer to his concern, the sound of loose rocks tumbling down came from somewhere to their right. Victoria spun, raising her revolver toward the new threat, but it was too late. Hollister appeared on the ridge above them, his rifle leveled at Bryce's head. Drop the guns, he commanded. Both of you. Victoria hesitated, her revolver still raised, mind racing for some way out of their desperate situation. "Do it, Victoria," Bryce said quietly. "It's not worth your life." With reluctance, Victoria lowered her weapon, placing it on the ground. Bryce did the same with his rifle, his movements stiff with pain. Hollister smiled in satisfaction, making his way down to their position while keeping his rifle trained on them. His remaining companion appeared on the trail below, leading the horses back up. "Smart decision," Hollister said, kicking their weapons aside. "Now, Mrs. Turner, you'll be coming with us back to Silver Creek. Your husband's quite eager to see you." "And Bryce?" Victoria asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "He needs medical attention." Hollister glanced at Bryce's blood-soaked side with indifference. "He'll stand trial for abduction, if he survives the journey back, that is." Rage flared in Victoria, hot and sudden. "He saved me from a man who nearly beat me to death. There was no abduction." "Save it for the judge, madam," Hollister replied dismissively. "My job is just to bring you in." As he moved to bind their hands, Victoria caught Bryce's eye. Something in his expression made her pause, a subtle shift that told her he had not yet given up. She watched as he swayed slightly on his feet, appearing weaker than he had moments before. "Need to sit," Bryce mumbled, his voice slurred. "Feeling light-headed." Hollister frowned but gestured with his rifle. "Sit then, but no sudden moves." Bryce nodded, moving to lower himself to the ground, and then lunged forward with a speed that belied his injured state, driving his shoulder into Hollister's midsection. The bounty hunter's rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as both men went down in a tangle of limbs. Victoria reacted instantly, diving for her discarded revolver. She heard a shout from the trail and turned to see Hollister's companion raising his gun. Without hesitation, she fired, catching the man in the arm. He stumbled backward, losing his balance on the narrow path, and falling with a cry that echoed through the mountains. Turning back to the struggle before her, Victoria found Bryce and Hollister locked in combat, rolling dangerously close to the edge of the plateau. Despite his injury, Bryce fought with desperate strength, landing several solid blows to the bounty hunter's face. But Hollister was uninjured and outweighed Bryce by at least 30 pounds. As Victoria watched in horror, he gained the upper hand, pinning Bryce beneath him and wrapping his hands around his throat. Victoria raised her revolver, but the men were too entangled for a clear shot. Without thinking, she rushed forward, bringing the butt of her gun down hard on the back of Hollister's head. The bounty hunter slumped forward, momentarily stunned, giving Bryce the opening he needed to push him aside. "The horses," Bryce gasped, struggling to his feet. "We need to go. Now." They moved as quickly as Bryce's injury would allow, gathering only their weapons and the most essential supplies before mounting. Behind them, Hollister was beginning to stir, groaning as he pushed himself to his knees. "The Eastern Trail," Bryce directed, his voice hoarse from Hollister's assault. "It's our only chance." Victoria nodded, taking the lead as they urged their horses onto the narrow path that wound down the eastern side of the mountain. The trail was treacherous, barely wide enough in places for a single rider, with a sheer drop to one side that made Victoria's head swim if she looked down. They had descended perhaps halfway when the sound of a rifle shot cracked through the air. Victoria flinched, expecting to feel the impact of a bullet, but it was Bryce who cried out behind her. She turned to see him clutching his left shoulder, fresh blood staining his shirt. "Keep going," he urged through gritted teeth. "Don't stop." Victoria hesitated, torn between the need to help him and the knowledge that their only hope lay in reaching the valley below. Another shot rang out, the bullet striking the rock wall beside them, showering them with stone fragments. "Go," Bryce shouted. Heart pounding, Victoria urged her horse forward, praying that Bryce could stay in the saddle behind her. They descended as fast as they dared on the treacherous path, each switchback taking them further from Hollister's position, but still within range of his rifle. The shots became more sporadic as they descended, then ceased altogether as they reached a bend in the trail that finally took them out of the bounty hunter's line of sight. When they at last emerged into the valley as dusk was falling, Victoria allowed herself a moment of relief before turning to check on Bryce. What she saw made her blood run cold. He was slumped forward in his saddle, his face ashen, both his side and shoulder now dark with blood. As she watched, he swayed dangerously. "Bryce!" Victoria cried, maneuvering her horse alongside his and reaching out to steady him. "Hold on, just hold on." His eyes, usually so alert and focused, were glazed with pain. "Can't," he murmured. "Sorry, Victoria." Before she could respond, he slipped from the saddle, hitting the ground with a heavy thud that drove a cry of distress from Victoria's throat. She dismounted in an instant, kneeling beside him in the gathering darkness. "Bryce, please," she begged, cradling his head. "Stay with me. We're almost safe." His eyes fluttered open, finding hers with effort. "You need to keep going," he whispered. "Clearwater. Ask for Sam Jenkins at the trading post." "I'm not leaving you," Victoria insisted, tears streaming down her face. "We'll rest here tonight, and tomorrow—" "No tomorrow for me," Bryce interrupted, his voice fading. "Too much blood loss. You need to go before Hollister finds a way down." "No," Victoria said fiercely. "I won't leave you to die alone, not after everything you've done for me." A ghost of a smile touched Bryce's lips. "Stubborn woman," he murmured. "Knew it from the first night." Victoria managed a tearful laugh. "Yes, well, you're equally stubborn, Bryce Lawson, so you're going to live. I won't accept anything else." As darkness fell completely around them, Victoria worked feverishly by the light of a small lantern from her saddlebag. She cleaned and bandaged Bryce's wounds as best she could, built a small, sheltered fire for warmth, and settled him on a bed of pine boughs covered with their blankets. Through the night, she kept vigil, bathing his fevered brow with cool water from a nearby stream, whispering encouragement when he stirred restlessly. In the darkest hours before dawn, when his breathing grew shallow and his skin burned with fever, Victoria held his hand and spoke of the future, the life they might build together in Clearwater, or somewhere even further from Jeffrey's reach, the home they could share, the peace they both deserved. Whether Bryce heard her words, she couldn't know, but speaking them aloud made them feel possible, turned them from desperate wishes into something like prayers. And as the first light of dawn crept into the valley, Victoria made a decision. She would not flee to Clearwater alone. Either they would both make it to safety, or neither would. With renewed determination, she examined their supplies and surroundings. They had 2 horses, weapons, minimal food, and the clothes on their backs. The valley stretched before them, leading northward toward distant mountains that likely held the settlement of Clearwater on their far side. And somewhere behind them, Dan Hollister would be finding his way down from the pass, intent on collecting his bounty regardless of the cost. Victoria's mind raced, weighing options, considering and discarding plans. Then, as the sun broke fully over the eastern ridge, illuminating the valley in golden light, an idea began to form, dangerous and desperate, but with a chance of success. She couldn't outrun Hollister, not with an injured man to care for. But perhaps she could outsmart him, use his single-minded pursuit against him. Quickly, Victoria gathered wood for a larger fire, building it up until the smoke would be visible for miles. She then arranged their bedrolls and supplies to make it appear as though they were still camped there. Next, she led both horses to the stream, allowing them to drink deeply before carefully loading Bryce onto the stronger of the 2. "What are you doing?" he asked weakly, consciousness returning as she secured him in the saddle with strips of cloth. "Getting us to Clearwater," Victoria replied, her tone allowing no argument, "but not by the direct route. Hollister will expect us to head straight north through the valley. We're going east instead, through those foothills, then circling back around." Bryce's eyes, clouded with pain though they were, held a spark of admiration. "Risky," he managed, "but smart." "I had a good teacher," Victoria said, squeezing his hand before mounting her own horse. They set off as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind the decoy camp with its smoke rising prominently into the clear morning air. Victoria led them eastward, away from the valley floor and into the broken terrain of the foothills, where their passage would be harder to track. The day that followed was the most grueling of Victoria's life. She pushed onward through increasingly difficult terrain, constantly checking on Bryce, who drifted in and out of consciousness. Twice they had to stop while she changed his bandages, alarmed by the amount of blood that still seeped from his wounds despite her best efforts to bind them. By late afternoon, Victoria was fighting exhaustion and despair in equal measure. Bryce's condition was deteriorating, and she knew with growing certainty that he needed proper medical care soon if he was to survive. Yet they were still at least a day's hard ride from Clearwater, assuming her circuitous route didn't add even more time to their journey. As dusk approached, Victoria guided them toward a small hollow surrounded by dense pines, hoping it would provide shelter for the night. As they entered the clearing, however, she reined her horse in sharply. Smoke was rising from a small fire at the far end of the hollow, and beside it sat a weathered wagon. Victoria reached for her revolver, wary of another trap, but before she could decide whether to retreat or approach, a figure emerged from beside the wagon, an elderly man with a long white beard, dressed in the simple garb of a frontier preacher. "Well now," the old man called, peering at them through spectacles perched on his nose. "Looks like you folks could use some help." Victoria hesitated, her hand still on her weapon. "Who are you?" "Name's Josiah Miller," the man replied, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "Circuit preacher for these parts, and unless I miss my guess, that man with you needs medical attention right quick." Victoria surveyed him carefully, looking for any sign of deception. Finding none in his open, concerned face, she slowly lowered her revolver. "My husband has been shot," she improvised, thinking quickly. "We were attacked by bandits in the pass." The old preacher nodded, apparently unsurprised. "These mountains can be dangerous for travelers. Bring him over by the fire, child. I've some skill with bullet wounds, though nothing fancy, mind you." With no better options, Victoria helped the preacher ease Bryce from the saddle and carry him to a bedroll beside the fire. As Josiah examined the wounds, his expression grew grave. "Fever's setting in," he observed, pressing a gnarled hand to Bryce's forehead. "And he's lost too much blood. I can clean these wounds proper, but he needs rest and care." "We're trying to reach Clearwater," Victoria explained, watching anxiously as the preacher began gathering supplies from his wagon. "Is it far?" "Day and a half by wagon from here," Josiah replied. "Less if you're riding hard, but your husband's in no condition for that." Victoria's heart sank. A day and a half might as well be an eternity given Bryce's condition and with Hollister still pursuing them. As if reading her thoughts, the preacher added, "You folks running from more than just bandits, I'm guessing." Victoria hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger. Something in the old man's kind eyes convinced her to trust him, at least partially. "There's a man following us," she admitted. "A bounty hunter. He wants to take me back to someone who hurt me badly." Josiah nodded slowly, his hands steady as he cleaned Bryce's wounds with a solution that smelled strongly of alcohol. "And this young man tried to protect you. He saved my life," Victoria said simply. The preacher worked in silence for a moment, his weathered hands gentle as he tended to Bryce's injuries. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but firm. "My wagon's headed for Clearwater come morning. You and your husband are welcome to ride along. Might not be as fast as horses, but it's safer for a wounded man, and I know paths through these hills that few others do." Relief washed over Victoria, so intense she felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "But what about the bounty hunter? I wouldn't want to bring danger to you." Josiah chuckled, a surprisingly robust sound from his thin frame. "Child, I've been riding these circuit trails for nigh on 40 years. Faced down everything from blizzards to Blackfoot war parties to claim jumpers with grudges. One bounty hunter doesn't frighten me." He paused, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "Besides, there's nothing in the good book that says a preacher can't also be a fair hand with a rifle." As if to emphasize his point, Josiah nodded toward a well-maintained Winchester leaning against the wagon wheel. For the first time in days, Victoria felt a genuine smile touch her lips. "Then we accept your kind offer, Preacher Miller." "Good," Josiah said with a decisive nod. "Now, let's get some food into you while I tell you about the settlement at Clearwater. If you're planning to start anew there, you'll want to know what you're riding into." As night fell fully around them, Victoria sat by the fire, listening to the preacher's stories of Clearwater while keeping a watchful eye on Bryce. The old man described a growing settlement with a sawmill, trading post, and even a small school being built, confirming what Bryce had told her about the teaching position. "Sam Jenkins runs the trading post," Josiah explained. "Good man, fair with his prices and doesn't water down his whiskey. His wife Emily's the one organizing the school. They've got 3 little ones of their own and decided the settlement needed proper education." "Bryce said Mr. Jenkins was expecting us," Victoria said. "That there might be a teaching position available." Josiah nodded. "Emily's been looking for someone with education to take over the teaching. She's been doing it herself, but with the new baby coming, she'll need help." He glanced at Bryce's unconscious form. "Your husband mentioned this to you?" Victoria hesitated only briefly. "Yes. We're hoping to make a fresh start in Clearwater, away from previous troubles." If the preacher noticed her hesitation, he gave no sign. "Clearwater's a good place for that. Folks there mind their business and judge a person by what they do, not where they came from." He added another log to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward into the night sky. "Get some rest now, child. We'll head out at first light." Victoria nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily. Still, she settled beside Bryce, taking comfort in the steady rise and fall of his chest. The preacher's medicine, a combination of whiskey, herbs, and frontier knowledge, seemed to have eased his fever somewhat. She must have dozed despite her concerns, for she woke with a start to the gray light of dawn. Josiah was already up, preparing coffee over a fresh fire and readying his wagon for travel. "How is he?" Victoria asked, moving immediately to check on Bryce. "Fever broke in the night," Josiah replied, bringing her a steaming cup of coffee. "That's a good sign. He's young and strong. With proper care, he should recover." Relief flooded through Victoria. She touched Bryce's forehead gently, finding it cooler than the night before. His eyes fluttered open at her touch, focusing on her face with recognition. "Victoria," he whispered, his voice rough with thirst and pain. "I'm here," she assured him, helping him take a small sip of water. "We're going to Clearwater today with Preacher Miller." Bryce's eyes moved to the old man by the fire, then back to Victoria, questioning. "He found us last night," she explained. He's been helping me tend your wounds. He's offered us passage in his wagon to Clearwater." Bryce nodded slightly, too weak for further questions. Victoria squeezed his hand reassuringly before helping Josiah prepare for their departure. Within the hour, they had Bryce settled as comfortably as possible in the back of the wagon, padded with blankets and sheltered from the sun by a canvas covering. As they set out, Victoria rode beside the wagon, scanning the surrounding terrain constantly for any sign of pursuit. Josiah guided his team of horses along narrow trails that wound through the foothills, sometimes barely wide enough for the wagon to pass. "Not many know these old trails," he explained when Victoria commented on their route. "They were made by trappers and Indians long before settlers came. Faster than the main roads, too, if you know how to navigate them." They traveled through the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and check on Bryce, who drifted in and out of consciousness. By late afternoon, Victoria's vigilance began to wane, lulled by the steady pace and the apparent safety of their journey. It was Josiah who spotted the rider first, a distant figure following their trail through a valley they had crossed hours earlier. "Could be just a traveler," he said, though his expression suggested he thought otherwise. "But best we pick up the pace regardless." Victoria felt fear clutch at her heart once more. "It's him," she said with certainty. "Hollister." Josiah nodded grimly. "Well, he's got a fair distance to make up, and we're close to Clearwater now. We'll reach the settlement by nightfall if we push on." They continued with renewed urgency, the wagon jolting over the increasingly rough terrain as Josiah urged his team forward. Victoria rode alongside, constantly looking back for signs of their pursuer. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and reds, they crested a final ridge, and Victoria saw it Clearwater, nestled in a valley below them, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the glint of a small river winding through the center of the settlement. "There she is," Josiah said with evident pride. "Not much to look at compared to eastern towns, but she's growing every year." Victoria felt a surge of emotion as she gazed down at what might become her new home, a place where Jeffrey had no influence, where she and Bryce might build a life together if he recovered. The moment of hope was short-lived, however, as the sound of a rifle shot echoed across the ridge behind them. Victoria turned to see a rider emerging from the tree line less than a quarter-mile back. Dan Hollister, his face visible even at this distance, set in grim determination. "He's found us," Victoria gasped. "So he has," Josiah agreed calmly, "but we've got the advantage now." He handed Victoria the reins to his team. "Keep them moving steady down this trail. It leads straight into town. I'll deal with our friend." Before Victoria could protest, the old preacher had retrieved his Winchester and positioned himself at the rear of the wagon, bracing the rifle against the wooden frame as he took aim. "Preacher Miller," Victoria called, alarmed. "You don't have to, child. I've lived a long and mostly peaceful life," Josiah interrupted, his eye still to the rifle sight. "But there are times when a man must stand for what's right. Now go on, get this wagon moving." With no choice but to comply, Victoria snapped the reins, urging the horses forward down the trail toward Clearwater. Behind her, she heard Josiah's rifle crack once, twice, 3 times in measured succession. The trail wound down the ridge in a series of switchbacks, each turn bringing the settlement closer. Victoria glanced back whenever she could, seeing Josiah still at his post, occasionally firing to keep Hollister at bay. The bounty hunter returned fire, but at the increasing distance, his shots went wide. By the time they reached the outskirts of Clearwater, dusk had deepened into twilight. Lights glowed warmly from cabin windows, and Victoria could make out figures moving about the main street, drawn by the unusual sight of a wagon racing into town. She guided the team toward what appeared to be the largest building, a combination trading post and general store with Jenkins Mercantile painted on a wooden sign above the door. As the wagon came to a halt, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache emerged from the store, followed by several other townspeople. "Josiah," the man called, approaching the wagon with a puzzled expression. "Wasn't expecting you back so soon. What's the rush?" Before Victoria could answer, Josiah's voice came from behind her. "Trouble following us, Sam. Bounty hunter by the name of Hollister." Victoria turned in surprise to find the preacher still in the wagon, though he had moved to check on Bryce. There was no sign of Hollister on the ridge above. "This here is Victoria," Josiah continued, gesturing toward her. "And her husband Bryce. He's been shot and needs tending. They're the ones I told you about in my letter. She's come for the teaching position." Sam Jenkins' eyebrows rose slightly, but he asked no questions, instead moving quickly to the back of the wagon. "Let's get him inside," he said, calling to several men nearby. "Martha," he shouted toward a woman standing in the doorway of the Mercantile, "fetch Doc Wilson and be quick about it." Everything happened with surprising speed after that. Bryce was carefully carried into the living quarters behind the store and placed on a clean bed. A gray-haired man arrived with a medical bag, introducing himself as Dr. Wilson before shooing everyone except Victoria from the room. As the doctor examined Bryce's wounds, Victoria found herself answering his questions mechanically, her mind still trying to process their sudden arrival in Clearwater and the apparent disappearance of Hollister. "These wounds have been well tended, Doctor," Wilson commented as he prepared to clean and redress them. "But there's significant blood loss and signs of infection beginning. He'll need rest, proper nourishment, and careful monitoring." "Will he recover?" Victoria asked, the question that mattered most. The doctor's eyes were kind as they met hers. "With proper care, yes. He's young and strong, but it will take time." Relief washed over Victoria, so profound she felt her knees weaken. She sank into a chair beside the bed, tears welling in her eyes. "You should rest yourself, Mrs. Lawson, Doctor," Wilson said gently. "You look near exhaustion." Victoria didn't correct his assumption about her name, too tired to explain the complicated truth. She merely nodded, allowing herself to be led to another room where a bed had been prepared. The last thing she remembered was Sam Jenkins' wife, a kind-faced woman with auburn hair, helping her remove her boots before she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When Victoria woke, sunlight was streaming through a small window, illuminating a simple but clean room. For a moment, she lay disoriented, trying to piece together where she was and how she had gotten there. Then the events of the previous days came rushing back: the desperate flight from Hollister, Bryce's injuries, their arrival in Clearwater. She sat up quickly, ignoring the protests of her own exhausted body. Bryce, she needed to check on Bryce. The door opened as she was pulling on her boots, and Emily Jenkins entered carrying a tray with coffee and what smelled like freshly baked bread. "Oh good, you're awake," Emily said with a warm smile. "I thought you might sleep the day away, and who could blame you after what you've been through?" "How long have I been asleep?" Victoria asked, accepting the cup of coffee gratefully. "Just the night through and half the morning," Emily assured her. "It's nearly noon now. And Bryce." Victoria caught herself, uncertain what story Josiah had shared with the townspeople. "Your husband's fever broke completely early this morning," Emily said, confirming that they were indeed believed to be married. "Doc Wilson says he's responding well to treatment. He's awake now, in fact, and asking for you." Victoria didn't wait to hear more. hastily setting down her coffee and moving past Emily toward the door. She found Bryce in the room where they had placed him the night before, propped up slightly against pillows, his face pale but his eyes clear and alert. "Victoria," he said as she entered, relief evident in his voice. "They told me you were safe, but I needed to see for myself." She crossed to his bedside, taking his hand in hers. "I'm fine," she assured him. "Better now that I know you're going to recover." Bryce squeezed her hand weakly. "Hollister," Victoria shook her head. "I don't know. He was pursuing us up to the ridge above town, but then, I'm not sure what happened. Josiah was keeping him at bay with rifle fire." "The preacher," Bryce nodded slightly. "I remember him vaguely, seemed like a good man." "He is," Victoria confirmed. "He saved your life, mine too, probably." A shadow crossed Bryce's face. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better." "You have nothing to apologize for," Victoria said firmly. "You risked everything to help me escape Jeffrey. I would never have made it this far without you." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Josiah entered, looking remarkably spry for a man who had engaged in a rifle battle the previous evening. "Good to see you awake, young man," the preacher said, approaching the bed. "You had us worried for a spell there." "Thank you for your help, Preacher Miller," Bryce said. "Victoria tells me we owe you our lives." Josiah waved away the gratitude. "Just doing what any decent Christian would, but I reckon you're wondering about that bounty hunter." Both Victoria and Bryce nodded, tension returning at the mention of Hollister. "No need to fret," Josiah assured them. "He won't be bothering you anymore, did you?" Victoria couldn't bring herself to finish the question. The old preacher's eyes twinkled. "Kill him? No, child. Despite what you may have thought, I wasn't aiming to kill, just to discourage. Last I saw, he was headed back the way he came, nursing a flesh wound to the shoulder and a severely damaged pride." Relief flooded through Victoria. Despite everything Hollister had done, she hadn't wanted his death on her conscience or Josiah's. "But what's to stop him from coming back?" Bryce asked, the concern evident in his voice. "Or sending word to Jeffrey about where we are?" "That's where things get interesting," Josiah said, settling into a chair beside the bed. "Seems our Mr. Hollister has some outstanding warrants of his own in Montana territory. Sheriff Edmonds mentioned it when I stopped by his office this morning to explain the situation. Apparently, Hollister was involved in a stagecoach robbery near Helena last year, something he'd likely prefer not to answer for. So he won't risk returning to this area," Victoria concluded, understanding dawning. "Not if he values his freedom," Josiah confirmed. "And as for your husband back in Silver Creek, well, his influence doesn't extend to Montana territory, especially not with Sheriff Edmonds being made aware of the true circumstances." Victoria felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, a burden she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten what it was like to be without it. "We're truly safe here. As safe as anyone can be in this world," Josiah said with a gentle smile. "Which is to say, you'll face the usual hardships of frontier life, harsh winters, occasional Indian troubles, the ordinary struggles of building a community. But as for your specific fears, yes, I believe you can rest easy on those counts." The conversation was interrupted by Emily Jenkins, who appeared at the door with a tray of food and a determined expression. "That's quite enough excitement for now," she declared. "This man needs rest and nourishment, not tales of bounty hunters and sheriffs." Josiah rose with a chuckle. "Emily's right, as usual. We can talk more once you've both had a chance to recover properly." He paused at the door, his expression turning more serious. "I'll be heading out tomorrow morning to continue my circuit, but I'll be back through Clearwater in a month or so. Hope to find you both settled in and thriving by then." After he had gone, Emily helped Victoria arrange the food tray for Bryce, then tactfully withdrew, leaving them alone once more. "She thinks we're married," Victoria said quietly once the door had closed. "I gathered that," Bryce replied, attempting to sit up straighter before wincing in pain. "Josiah's doing, I suppose," Victoria nodded. "It was simpler under the circumstances, less to explain." A silence fell between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken questions about their future. It was Bryce who finally broke it, his voice soft but determined. "Victoria, when I thought I might die on that mountain, there was only one regret in my heart, that I hadn't told you plainly how I feel about you." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. "Bryce, let me finish," he said gently. "I know your situation is complicated. You're still legally married to Jeffrey, and we've known each other only a short time. But in that time, I've come to care for you more deeply than I thought possible. Whatever happens next, whatever you decide, I wanted you to know that." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes, not of sorrow but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. "I thought I might lose you," she whispered, "and it felt as though my heart would break. I've never felt that way before, not even when I believed I loved Jeffrey." Bryce reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I don't know what the future holds, Victoria. I don't know if you can legally free yourself from your husband or what challenges we might face. But I know that I want to face them with you if you'll have me." Victoria leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "Yes," she said simply. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." In that moment, in a small room behind a frontier trading post, with the sounds of a growing settlement filtering through the window, Victoria Turner felt truly safe for the first time in years, not just because the immediate danger had passed, but because she had found something she had begun to believe no longer existed. A love built on mutual respect and genuine caring, a chance to begin anew. The weeks that followed were a time of healing and new beginnings. Bryce recovered slowly but steadily under Dr. Wilson's care and Victoria's attentive nursing. The people of Clearwater accepted them without question, taking Josiah's word and their evident devotion to each other as all the introduction needed. Emily Jenkins proved to be not just a kind hostess, but a friend and mentor, introducing Victoria to the families whose children would be her students once the schoolhouse was completed. Sam Jenkins offered Bryce a position helping with the trading post once he was well enough, recognizing the value of a man who knew the mountains and could handle himself in frontier situations. As April blossomed into May, Victoria began teaching in a temporary arrangement, holding classes in the community church building while the schoolhouse was being finished. The work brought her a satisfaction she had almost forgotten, the joy of seeing young minds engage with knowledge, the sense of contributing to the growing community that had welcomed her so warmly. In the evenings, she and Bryce would often sit on the small porch of the cabin they had been given, watching the sunset and planning their future. They spoke of building their own home once Bryce was fully recovered, of the life they would create together in this new place. Yet one shadow remained: Victoria's marriage to Jeffrey. Though she felt free of him in spirit, legally she was still his wife, a fact that prevented her and Bryce from truly beginning their life together as they wished. It was Josiah who brought the solution when he returned to Clearwater in early June. He arrived with his wagon as promised, but he was not alone. With him was a lawyer from Helena, a serious-looking man named Herbert Franklin who specialized in divorce proceedings. "Divorce is difficult but not impossible in the territories," Mr. Franklin explained as they sat in Sam Jenkins' parlor, documents spread across the table. "Especially in cases involving cruelty or abandonment. Your situation, Mrs. Turner, includes both." "But my husband will contest it," Victoria said, the old fear creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. "He'll never agree to release me." "He may not have to," the lawyer replied, selecting a particular document from the pile. "This is a notice published in the Silver Creek Gazette 2 weeks ago." He handed the paper to Victoria, who read it with growing astonishment. It was a legal notice declaring her officially missing and presumed dead after an extensive search failed to find any trace of her following her disappearance during a blizzard. Jeffrey Turner, as her grieving husband, was announcing his intention to have her legally declared deceased. "He's given up looking for me," Victoria whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "But why?" Mr. Franklin's expression was one of professional satisfaction. "It seems your husband's reputation in Silver Creek has suffered considerably in recent months. Rumors about his treatment of you began circulating after your disappearance, likely started by those who had witnessed his behavior but previously remained silent. Additionally, his business ventures have apparently taken a turn for the worse. And declaring me dead benefits him how?" Victoria asked, still suspicious of Jeffrey's motives. "It allows him to maintain the narrative that you were lost in a tragic accident rather than that you fled from his abuse," the lawyer explained. "It preserves what remains of his reputation. And it gives him access to your family inheritance, which was held in trust as part of your marriage settlement." Victoria felt a momentary pang at the thought of losing her modest inheritance from her parents, but it passed quickly. Freedom from Jeffrey was worth far more than any amount of money. "So what does this mean for Victoria?" Bryce asked, his hand finding hers under the table. "Legally speaking," Mr. Franklin steepled his fingers thoughtfully, "it presents us with an unusual opportunity. Rather than contesting the declaration of death, we can use it to our advantage. As far as Wyoming territory is concerned, Victoria Turner died in that blizzard, which means—" "I'm free," Victoria breathed, understanding dawning. "If I'm legally dead, my marriage is over." "Precisely," the lawyer confirmed. "You would need to establish a new legal identity here in Montana territory, of course. But that's relatively straightforward, especially with the support of respected community members." He nodded toward Josiah and the Jenkinses, who had been silent but attentive throughout the discussion. "And then," Bryce pressed, the hope evident in his voice, Mr. Franklin allowed himself a small smile. "Then, should you wish to marry, there would be no legal impediment to doing so." Victoria turned to Bryce, tears of joy welling in her eyes. He squeezed her hand, his own eyes reflecting the same emotion. "I believe we have some paperwork to complete, Mr. Franklin," Victoria said, not looking away from Bryce's face. The lawyer nodded, already reaching for his pen and inkwell. "Indeed we do, miss. What shall we call you now?" Victoria thought for a moment, then smiled. "Lawson," she said decisively. "Victoria Lawson." 3 weeks later, on a perfect summer morning, Victoria stood in the newly completed schoolhouse, making final preparations for the first official day of classes. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the rows of simple desks and the chalkboard she had carefully lettered with a welcome message for her students. The sound of footsteps on the wooden porch made her turn. Bryce stood in the doorway, tall and straight, fully recovered from his wounds. He wore a new shirt and his best pants, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. "The children will be here soon," Victoria said, though they both knew that wasn't why he had come. "I know," Bryce replied, crossing to stand before her, "but I wanted a moment with you first, before we go to the church." Victoria smiled, reaching up to straighten his collar. "Nervous, Mr. Lawson, terrified," he admitted with a grin, "but in the best possible way Mrs. Lawson to be." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it out to her. It was a ring, simple but beautiful, a band of gold with a small pearl set into it. "It was my mother's," Bryce explained as Victoria gasped softly. "I asked Sam to send for it from my bank deposit in Cheyenne. I wanted you to have something special today." Victoria extended her hand, allowing Bryce to slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly as though made for her. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I'll cherish it always." Bryce raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above the ring. "Not as much as I cherish you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "When you stumbled into my barn that night, your face bruised and your hands shaking, all I wanted was to keep you safe. I never imagined you would end up saving me right back." Victoria stepped closer, resting her hands on his chest. "We saved each other," she corrected gently, "and we'll keep doing so every day for the rest of our lives." The sound of children's voices approaching broke the moment. Bryce stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'll see you at the church in an hour, Victoria Lawson." "I'll be the one in blue," she replied with a smile, referring to the new dress Emily had helped her make for the occasion. As Bryce left to make his own preparations, Victoria turned back to the classroom, heart full. Outside, she could hear her students gathering, their excited chatter filling the morning air. In an hour, she would marry the man she loved in front of the community that had taken them in. And tomorrow, she would begin teaching in earnest, helping to shape the future of this frontier town that had become her home. From the bruised and frightened woman who had fled into the night, to the confident teacher and beloved bride she was becoming, it had been a journey of both hardship and hope. As Victoria welcomed her first students into the schoolhouse, she silently thanked whatever providence had guided her to Bryce Lawson's barn on that winter night, bringing her not just safety, but a love and a future beyond anything she could have imagined.